Chapter 26. Unfortunately, I'd traversed only half a block when the scent of werewolf rose up around me. "Going somewhere?" Gunnar demanded as he stepped out of an alcove to block my path. I flinched backwards, wishing I could pretend I was still the same person I'd been 1 hour earlier. Then, I'd been glad for this male to join me. Yes, he was trouble, but he also seemed to possess a gentlemanly willingness to set aside my secrets in an effort to bring Kira back. Now, though, my cards were face up on the table, and I couldn't afford dragging an alpha werewolf along for the ride. So I hesitated 1 second longer than I should have, at which point Gunnar struck. Between one eye blink and the next, his hand was inside my pocket. Then the ziplock of fake IDs emerged squeezed between skillful fingers, despite my attempt to twist away. I started, only to freeze as his other arm landed like a manacle around my waist, while the first pried open the plastic bag. "You're running," the alpha growled, his breath hot against the top of my head. He paged through paper and plastic that Kira and I would need to create a new life together, his voice turning chillier with each flipped-over item. "Is your sister even missing? Or is that just another lie?" "I've never lied to you," I countered, contemplating ways to free myself from my captor's handhold. Despite our size difference, I could have used his ill-considered grip to throw Gunnar over my back so I could flee while he lay winded on the pavement. Or my starball-turned dagger could stab the pesky werewolf in the gut for a more final form of freedom than that. And yet, I hovered indecisively, kicking myself for being unwilling to make a move against Gunnar. My arena fights had gone south many times over the last decade, with dozens of matches ending in hospitalizations rather than a simple scratch on the cheek. So why did the mere thought of injuring a werewolf make me shiver uncontrollably now? No matter the reason, my opponent didn't miss the change in mood. His arm softened as he pulled me in closer, and his next words were midway between human speech and werewolf growl. "Tell me what's wrong, and I'll fix it," the male murmured. He sounded so solid, so dependable. But before I could answer, the decision was taken out of my hands. First came a yip, followed by a single howl. Then the cacophony grew, until lupine voices were erupting all around us from over a dozen throats. The newcomers must have scouted the scene before announcing themselves, because they weren't coming from one direction alone. Instead, they'd blocked passage down the street in both directions, north and south pathways equally cut off from the potential for retreat. I spared one quick glance toward the alpha, who still held me up against him, hoping this was merely Atwood backup finally making themselves known. But of course, Gunnar would never have allowed such overt wolfishness in a human neighborhood. So I wasn't at all surprised to see the alpha's eyebrows rising, while the air around us filled with the unmistakable tang of fur. Nope, the encroaching pack wasn't friendly, and based on their numbers, Gunnar and I were dramatically outmatched. "Put this somewhere safe, then shift." The ziplock of IDs whizzed toward me, even as Gunnar spun away to peer down the darkened street in both directions. And while I did take the time to carefully stash the bag into an inside pocket, I just as overtly disobeyed the Alpha's second command. After all, donning my fox form would have been sure suicide. So I molded my starball into a sword instead, and came to stand beside Gunnar on 2 human feet. "You'd be safer as a wolf," he observed, although I noticed the male made no move to follow his own advice. Then, when I didn't answer, "I don't suppose you have another sword I could borrow?" "Here." I hoped the darkness was deep enough so my companion couldn't see my rapier narrowing by half, as I pulled the second weapon out of the sheath along my spine. Starball metal was strong if formed properly, so I wasn't worried that even a half-width blade might fail to do its job. What was more concerning was whether being separated from so much of my magic would dull my reaction time. Strangely, I felt stronger rather than weaker, as the not-quite-solid weapon slipped into my companion's waiting hand. Gunnar nodded his thanks briefly before calling out into the darkness as the click of nails on pavement grew audible against the night. "Last chance to talk out our differences. Don't start something you're going to regret." It was a nice gesture on his part, but none of the enemy shifters currently possessed human vocal cords with which to reply to him, nor did they have any interest in backing down. Instead, they sprang upon us in two synchronized waves, yips and snarls preceding fur and claws by barely enough seconds to allow me to angle my sword toward the shadows rushing toward me out of the night. After that, nothing but fangs and growls mattered, and I had to admit that even my starball wouldn't have been enough to keep me afloat had I been flying solo. But, back to back with Gunnar, we were able to fend off the attackers, even if we failed to gain actual ground. The night was dark, and the wolves were many, so it took me quite a while to figure out who we were fighting against. Jackal, I realized, picking out the white-ruffed wolf, even as I sliced a wicked wound through the hamstring of his second-in-command. Had I been wrong in my reassessing of the situation? Was my pretend boyfriend the strangely polite note-leaver who had snatched my sister off the street in pursuit of an agenda of his own? As if sensing my confusion, Jackal shimmered upward into humanity, even as two of his packmates attempted to take me down from the left and right. Good thing Gunnar had eyes in the back of his head, or at least the alpha fought as if he did. Knocking one wolf onto its tail with a rather impressive sidekick, my partner opened up enough space so I could swipe a welt across the other wolf's nose. Then Jackal was standing naked in the middle of the street, without concern for shifter secrecy or human modesty. "You made the wrong decision, little girl," he told me, advancing forward until he stood just beyond the reach of my sword. "I would have protected you. This filth will not." In reaction, Gunnar growled deep in his throat, his back muscles tightening where they were pressed up against my own. But my companion didn't turn his head to answer, just kept attacking and parrying while providing leeway in which I could speak. "I want my sister back," I demanded, ignoring Jackal's insults and cutting straight to the heart of the matter. "What is it you want in exchange?" And to my surprise, my opponent's brow furrowed while his head tilted to one side. "You want your sister back?" I had just enough time to realize Jackal had no idea what I was talking about, that he hadn't been the kidnapper and note writer, and presumably had no notion that I shifted into the form of a fox rather than that of a wolf. But before I could decide how that understanding changed the face of the current battle, Gunnar roared behind me, and a strange lethargy flooded my limbs. Meanwhile, a gleaming something whizzed away into the darkness, even as my legs began trembling with their effort to hold me erect. I whimpered like a puppy, my vision turned muddy. Then, to my eternal chagrin, I fell onto my knees.